Welcome to our channel. Today, we're diving into an incredible story about love, transformation, and the power of forgiveness. Get ready to be moved as we explore how two people overcame their pasts to find something truly beautiful. Brian Montero, a wealthy man known for his arrogance, decided to marry his newly hired maid on a bet, unaware that their wedding night would bring a shocking revelation. The evening began at the Montero mansion, where Brian hosted an extravagant party attended by his affluent friends. Champagne flowed freely, and Brian commanded the attention of the room with his air of superiority. Among the guests was Thomas Soriano, notorious for his sharp wit and love of challenges. With a mischievous grin, Thomas approached Brian and said, "You're always claiming that money can change anything. Let's see you prove it." Brian, clearly unimpressed, replied, "Money is the most powerful tool. There's nothing it can't buy or transform." Thomas smirked and retorted, "It's easy to say that when you're surrounded by people who only agree with you, but can you actually demonstrate it?" The room fell silent, all eyes on Brian, as the challenge hung in the air. Brian crossed his arms and asked, "How exactly do you expect me to prove what's already obvious?" Thomas leaned in, grinning. "I'll bet you $5 million that you can't marry someone completely outside your social circle, a woman who doesn't meet your standards of beauty, and stay married to her for 3 months, convince the world it's real, and transform her in the process." Laughter and murmurs filled the room as Brian scoffed at the idea. "You can't be serious," he said. "Me, married to someone who doesn't fit my standards? That's not even worth considering." But Thomas wasn't about to let the idea drop. Glancing around the room, he spotted Mary, a maid who was serving champagne. Her simple black and white uniform and humble demeanor made her stand out among the glittering guests. "How about her?" Thomas said, nodding toward Mary. "She's definitely not your type. Perfect for the challenge." Brian frowned, clearly unimpressed. "You want me to marry my maid? That's absurd." Thomas grinned, enjoying the provocation. "If money really can buy anything, this should be easy for you, or are you afraid you'll lose?" The guests waited, their curiosity piqued by the bet. Brian felt the challenge strike at his pride. Backing down wasn't an option. After a moment of careful thought, Brian finally raised his glass and said with a cold smile, "Deal. 3 months with her, and I'll prove to you that there's no challenge I can't conquer." The room buzzed with laughter and intrigue as Thomas extended his hand. "This will be fun," he said, adding with a smirk, "but remember, you have to make it look real. If you fail, I'll be $5 million richer." Brian narrowed his eyes. "I never fail. Get ready to lose your money." The next morning, Mary was washing dishes in the kitchen when she heard footsteps. Turning, she saw Brian standing in the doorway. "Mr. Montero, do you need something?" she asked hesitantly. Brian stepped closer, his hands in his pockets. "Yes, Mary," he said. "I have a proposal for you." Mary looked at him, puzzled. "A proposal?" Brian leaned in slightly, carefully choosing his words. "Mary, I want you to marry me." Mary's hands shook, and the plate she was holding slipped, shattering in the sink and spraying water everywhere. "What?" she asked, not sure she had heard him correctly. Brian's tone remained calm, businesslike. "You heard me. It's a contract, a marriage of convenience. You'll be my wife for 3 months. In return, I'll pay you enough money to completely change your life." Mary let out a nervous laugh, almost as if he were joking. "That's not funny, Mr. Montero." "I'm not joking," he said seriously, pulling a check from his pocket and placing it on the counter. The amount written was staggering, more than enough to solve all her financial problems. "You're struggling, aren't you? With this money, you can start over. So, what do you say?" Mary stared at the check, then back at Brian. She knew he was accustomed to having control over everything around him. To him, she was just a tool for his purposes, not a person. "Why me?" she asked, still trying to make sense of it all. "You're perfect for it," Brian replied bluntly. "No one would expect me to marry someone like you, and that's exactly why it will work." Mary squirmed at his honesty. It made her feel exposed, as if she were just a pawn in a game. She wanted to say no, to refuse outright, but she couldn't stop thinking about the bills piling up and the pressure of supporting her family. "And if I agree, what happens after 3 months?" she asked carefully. "We get divorced," Brian said flatly. "No questions, no strings. You go back to your life, and I go back to mine. The difference is, you'll be much better off than when you started." Mary drew in a shaky breath. She realized that saying yes meant giving up a part of herself, but it also might be the only way to give her family a new start. "I'll do it," she said quietly. Brian gave her a satisfied smile. "Good. Tomorrow you'll be my wife." Mary watched him leave the kitchen with a heavy heart. She knew she was stepping into a dangerous situation, but for the first time in years, she also felt a faint glimmer of hope. Perhaps this could change everything. The next morning, the atmosphere in the Montero mansion was different. Staff members whispered among themselves, puzzled by Brian's unusual behavior. It was rare to see him at home so early, let alone dressed in formal attire. But for Mary, the day started like any other. She was out in the garden, kneeling on the grass as she gathered leaves that had fallen from the old trees. The scent of damp earth and flowers was soothing, and for a moment she felt peaceful. Then she saw Brian standing over her. "Mary," he said. She quickly stood, brushing off her hands against her apron and unintentionally smearing dirt on it. Her eyes met Brian's, and she saw something in his expression she hadn't noticed before, a mix of determination and expectation. "Mr. Montero," she said, struggling to keep her voice steady. "Is there something you need?" "Everything's ready," he said simply. "We're going to the registry office in an hour." Her breath caught. "Already?" "Yes. The sooner we start, the better," Brian said coldly. "The documents are ready. You just need to sign." Mary's heart pounded. Up until that moment, the arrangement had seemed like a distant possibility, almost unreal. Now, with the reality of marriage looming so close, she felt her stomach twist. "I need more time," she said, her voice uncertain. Brian tilted his head slightly. "Time for what? You already agreed. I don't like to wait." Mary wanted to back out, but images of her family's hardships came rushing back to her. The worn-down house, her siblings' tired faces, and the endless pile of bills. With a deep sigh, she gave a small nod. "Fine," she said, almost in a whisper. "I'm ready." An hour later, Mary found herself in the back seat of Brian's sleek black car. The interior was immaculate, but she couldn't relax. Brian sat beside her, completely engrossed in his phone, as though she wasn't even there. Mary looked out the window at the city, rushing past. Downtown felt like another world, one full of towering buildings, exclusive stores, and impeccably dressed people who never spared a glance at anyone around them. "We're here," Brian said suddenly, putting his phone away as the car stopped in front of an imposing building. Mary stepped out hesitantly, and Brian held the door open for her. Inside, the registry office was quiet. 2 lawyers stood waiting, along with a handful of staff who seemed well instructed not to ask questions. Mary's stomach knotted as she held the pen, her hand trembling. Forcing herself to stay calm, she signed the papers. Within minutes, she was Mrs. Montero. Brian shook hands with the registrar and turned to Mary with a faint smile. "Congratulations. We're officially husband and wife." Mary avoided his gaze. "Not really," she murmured. Brian didn't respond. He simply escorted her back to the car, and the silence between them felt heavier than ever. When they returned to the mansion, Mary immediately noticed changes. The curtains had been replaced with more elegant drapes. The lighting was warmer, and the main hall had been redecorated. It felt staged, as though the house itself was preparing for some grand performance. Brian led Mary upstairs to a new room. When he opened the door, she saw a lavish bedroom complete with an enormous bed, velvet curtains, and a walk-in closet larger than her family's entire home. "This will be your room," Brian said, his tone matter-of-fact, as though it was the most natural thing in the world. Mary walked into the room, her eyes scanning her surroundings. Every detail of the space seemed to tell her she didn't belong. "It's beautiful," she said finally, not sure what else to say. "I'm glad you're impressed," Brian replied coolly. "You're my wife now, and it's important that everyone believes it, especially the people in my circle." Mary turned to face him, crossing her arms. "What exactly do you expect from me, Mr. Montero?" Brian raised an eyebrow at her tone. He wasn't used to being challenged, but Mary showed no sign of making things easy. "I expect you to play the part," he said firmly. "Elegant dresses, perfect posture, no impulsive behavior." Mary let out a dry laugh. "Of course, because appearances are the only thing that matter here, aren't they?" Brian frowned, but didn't respond. He knew there was truth to her words, though he wasn't about to admit it. "Tomorrow morning, a stylist will come by to help you select the appropriate clothes," he said flatly. Mary sighed, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She didn't want to agree, but she knew she was stuck in this arrangement. "Fine. If that's what you want, I'll do my part. But don't expect me to change who I am." Brian shrugged, as though it didn't matter. "That's your choice, Mary. As long as you stick to the agreement, I don't care who you are." With that, he left the room, leaving Mary alone in the cold, unfamiliar space. She sat down on the edge of the bed, feeling small and out of place. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she quickly blinked them away. 3 months, she whispered to herself. Just 3 months. Meanwhile, Brian descended the stairs with determined steps, already planning his next move in the bet. For reasons he couldn't explain, Mary unsettled him. She wasn't like anyone else he'd known, and that bothered him. He game had begun, but neither of them could foresee the unexpected twists the future would bring. The next morning, Mary was woken by a soft knock at the door. Before she could respond, a tall, elegant woman in a perfectly tailored suit walked in. 2 assistants followed her, wheeling in a rack filled with luxurious dresses. "Good morning, Mrs. Montero," the woman said with a professional smile. "My name is Clara. I've been hired by your husband to help you dress properly for upcoming events." Mary, still sitting on the bed, blinked in confusion. "Upcoming events?" Clara nodded and began arranging the dresses. "Yes. Mr. Montero believes appearances are critical, particularly for someone in your position. He's ordered a complete wardrobe for you." Mary scoffed and stood up. "Is this really necessary?" Clara paused her work to look at Mary directly. "With all due respect, ma'am, necessary or not, this is what he wants. I suggest you make the most of it." Mary wanted to argue, but practicality won out. "Fine. Let's just get this over with." Clara smiled approvingly. "An excellent choice." Over the next several hours, Mary endured being dressed, measured, and styled as the assistants discussed fabrics and colors as if she were a mannequin. She felt out of place, but even surrounded by opulence, she knew the truth. No amount of tailoring could ever make her truly fit into Brian's world. When she finally descended the stairs, she found Brian waiting in the main hall, seated in a leather armchair. He glanced up from the tablet he was holding and studied her without saying anything at first. "Not bad," he said finally, his tone indifferent. "Thanks, I guess," Mary replied dryly, crossing her arms. Brian stood and adjusted his tie, ignoring her sarcasm. "We have an event tonight. A dinner with some of my friends. I expect you to be ready." Mary narrowed her eyes. "A dinner? And when were you planning on telling me about this?" "Now," he said, matter-of-factly. Mary sighed, exasperated. "Fine, but don't expect me to act like someone I'm not, Brian." Brian smirked. "As long as you don't embarrass me, that's all that matters." That evening, they arrived at an exclusive restaurant renowned for its extravagant decor and elite clientele. The moment Brian and Mary walked in, all eyes turned toward them. Brian strode confidently ahead, while Mary kept pace beside him, trying her best to ignore the curious stares. At their table, Thomas and 2 other friends, both involved in the bet, were already waiting. As soon as Mary sat down, Thomas greeted her with a sarcastic smile. "So this is the famous Mrs. Montero," he said, his tone dripping with mockery. Mary felt her face flush, but managed to keep her composure. "Yes, that's me," she replied evenly. Thomas laughed. "I have to admit, Brian, you've outdone yourself this time." Brian shot Thomas a cold glare, but chose not to respond, knowing that any reaction would only give Thomas more satisfaction. Mary, however, wasn't willing to let him get away with it. "And you, Thomas, do you usually spend so much time judging other people's lives?" she asked. The question caught everyone at the table off guard. Thomas nearly choked on his wine, while the others chuckled quietly. Brian glanced at Mary, surprised by her boldness, but he said nothing. There was something in her attitude, strength, courage, that he hadn't noticed before. The rest of the dinner continued with shallow conversation, but Mary could feel the weight of every glance, every observation from Brian's friends. It was clear she was being judged, but she refused to let it show. When they finally left the restaurant and climbed into the car, Mary exhaled deeply, looking out the window. "Well, that was interesting," she said. Brian leaned slightly forward, his gaze fixed on her. "You handled it well," he said. Mary turned to him, surprised by the compliment. "Thanks, I guess." Brian gave a faint smile, but remained silent. For the first time, he realized he had underestimated Mary, and that unsettled him. Over the next few days, Mary adjusted to her new routine at the mansion. Though she still felt like an outsider, the staff, initially skeptical of her, began to respect her humility and dedication. Meanwhile, Brian watched her from a distance. He was a man who prided himself on controlling every detail of his life, but Mary remained an enigma, something he couldn't quite decipher. One night, while reviewing documents in his office, Brian heard soft footsteps approaching. He glanced up and saw Mary standing at the door, holding a cup of tea. "You look like you need a break," she said, walking in without hesitation. Brian raised an eyebrow, surprised by her audacity. "And you think you can tell me what to do?" he asked. Mary shrugged, placing the cup on his desk. "It doesn't hurt to try." Brian picked up the cup and inhaled the scent of the fresh herbs. "Thanks," he said. Mary sat in one of the chairs opposite him, glancing at the papers scattered across his desk. "You work a lot." "Someone has to," he replied curtly. Mary smiled slightly. "Even so, you should rest sometimes." Brian studied hair, intrigued. There was something about her straightforward simplicity that unsettled him, as though she reminded him of something he'd long forgotten. "You're different," he said, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Mary tilted her head, caught off guard. "Different? How?" "I don't know," Brian admitted, shaking his head as though trying to push the thought aside. "Just different." Mary laughed softly. "I guess I'll take that as a compliment." She stood, ready to leave, but before walking out, she turned back. "Good night, Brian." "Good night, Mary," he replied, his eyes following her as she closed the door behind her. He leaned back in his chair, still holding the teacup. For the first time, in a long while, he felt a strange sense of calm that he couldn't explain. The next morning, Brian called Mary to the backyard garden, where an unusual scene awaited. Under the large oak tree, a table had been set with fine silverware, crystal glasses, and a stack of books. Clara, Mary's stylist, stood nearby with her usual professional demeanor. Beside her was an elegant older woman with an air of authority. As Mary approached, Brian introduced her. "Mary, this is Esther," he said, gesturing toward the grey-haired woman. "She's an etiquette specialist. For the next few weeks, you'll have daily lessons to learn how to behave properly." Mary frowned, clearly unimpressed. "Etiquette lesson? You can't be serious." "I'm completely serious," Brian replied, crossing his arms as if daring her to refuse. "You need to know how to conduct yourself at the events I attend. We can't afford any mistakes." Mary let out an incredulous laugh. "Of course, because nothing's more important than looking perfect for the people you want to impress, right?" "Exactly," he replied coolly, ignoring her sarcasm. "Now, let's get started." Mary knew she couldn't simply walk away from the arrangement, but that didn't mean she had to make things easy for Brian. She sat down at the table, arms crossed. "Fine. Teach me how to be perfect, then." The first lessons were a test of patience for everyone involved. Esther, with her impeccable posture and unshakable calm, demonstrated how to hold a wine glass, use the correct utensils, and walk gracefully. Mary, however, made deliberate mistakes just to gauge Brian's reaction. "Mary," Esther said, exhaling sharply as Mary dropped a fork for the third time. "You need to focus." "I'm trying," Mary replied, flashing a mischievous smile. From his spot nearby, Brian narrowed his eyes. "Mary, you know this is necessary." "Necessary for whom?" Mary retorted. "For you? Because I'm perfectly fine the way I am." Mary shot him a defiant look, her eyes challenging his authority. "It's necessary for both of us," Brian said firmly. "I don't make bets to lose." Mary smirked, but picked up the fork again. Although she didn't like being ordered around, part of her wanted to prove she could master these lessons, not to please Brian, but to show him he didn't get to define her. As the days passed, Mary noticed small shifts in her routine. The etiquette lessons, while still frustrating, became easier as she gained confidence in the basics. Her relationship with Brian, however, remained tense. One evening, as they sat at dinner, Brian watched Mary intently, clearly waiting for her to slip up. Noticing his gaze, she deliberately placed her fork and knife on her plate with precision, then smiled at him. "Are you satisfied?" she asked, her tone defiant. Brian gave her a slight, almost amused smile. "I'll admit, you're improving." "Well, I'm a dedicated student," Mary replied with a hint of sarcasm. Despite her teasing tone, something between them shifted. That night, Brian found himself seeing Mary in a new light. She wasn't just a challenge. She was smart, resourceful, and undeniably resilient. The next morning, Brian brought Mary along to her first high society event, a charity brunch, hosted by one of his business associates, Clarice Belmont. Mary wore an elegant blue gown chosen by Clara, and as they entered the grand hall, she felt every pair of eyes on her. Nervous but determined, Mary held her head high. Clarice, a sophisticated and poised woman, approached them with a welcoming smile. "Brian, darling, and who is this lovely lady?" "This is my wife, Mary," Brian said, forcing a polite smile. Clarice raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised, but quickly masked her reaction with a courteous handshake. "A pleasure to meet you." "Brian never mentioned he was married," Mary smiled politely, fully aware of the underlying judgment. "The pleasure is mine," she replied. During the brunch, Mary could feel the guests' eyes on her, scrutinizing every move, wondering how someone like her had ended up by Brian's side. Instead of shrinking under the attention, she used it as fuel. When Clarice casually asked Mary about her thoughts on philanthropy, Mary responded without hesitation. "I think helping others shouldn't be limited to events like this. It's something we can all do every day, even in small ways." Her straightforward answer caught everyone off guard. Brian, who had been ready to jump in and control the conversation, paused, realizing she had impressed them. "An interesting perspective," Clarice said, raising her glass. "Brian, it seems your wife has a lot to teach us." For the first time, Mary felt a small sense of triumph. She had held her own. When they returned to the mansion, Brian stopped in the hallway and turned to her. "You were impressive today." Mary raised an eyebrow, surprised by the compliment. "Is that a compliment?" "Yes," he admitted with a faint smile. "You managed to win people over, even though you're completely different from them." Mary laughed softly, crossing her arms. "Maybe that's because I'm not trying to be like them." Brian studied her for a moment, his expression shifting. "Maybe that's why they find you so intriguing." Mary glanced away, suddenly uneasy. "I just did what felt right," she said. "Keep it up, Mary," Brian replied before heading upstairs. Mary watched him walk away, and for the first time, she felt she was starting to understand him. Beneath his cold arrogance, there was more to Brian than he let on, something even he didn't fully acknowledge. As the weeks went by, the tense coexistence between them revealed unexpected sides of both. Brian began noticing that Mary carried a quiet burden. One night, he found her sitting alone in the mansion's garden, clutching a small notebook in her hands. She turned the pages absent-mindedly, her face clouded with melancholy. "It's late," Brian said, announcing his presence. Mary started, quickly closing the notebook. "I couldn't sleep," she replied. "Neither could I," he said, moving closer. "What are you reading?" "It's just something of mine," Mary answered, her voice hesitant. Brian could tell she was uncomfortable and decided not to press further, but the mystery surrounding that notebook lingered in his mind. It was important to her, and he couldn't help but wonder why. The next day, as Mary worked in the kitchen, Brian remained in his office, his thoughts drifting between his reports and the memory of her in the garden. He couldn't shake the curiosity about that notebook. After lunch, while Mary was still occupied downstairs, he found himself standing in front of her room. After hesitating, he pushed the door open. There it was on the dresser, next to a wilting bouquet, the notebook. He picked it up carefully, flipping through the pages. To his surprise, it was filled with sketches and short entries resembling a personal diary. Some pages depicted delicate flowers and landscapes, while others contained brief, reflective notes. One particular page caught his attention. A drawing of two children holding hands with a woman. Beneath it, a note read, "I promised to protect them, no matter the cost." Brian frowned. Who were these children? He hadn't known Mary had siblings, or children of her own. That evening at dinner, Brian couldn't hide his curiosity. He watched Mary closely, his thoughts racing. "Why are you staring at me like that?" Mary finally asked, setting down her fork. "Do you have siblings?" Brian asked, ignoring her question. Mary froze for a moment, her expression briefly unguarded before she regained composure. "Why do you ask?" she replied cautiously. "Just curious," Brian said casually, masking his real intentions. Mary looked away, clearly uncomfortable. "I have two younger brothers. They're fine, or at least I hope they are." "You don't speak to them," Brian pressed. Mary sighed heavily, putting her fork down. "There's not much to say. It's been years. They live with an aunt in another city." Brian noticed the strain in her voice, but didn't push further. He knew there was more to the story, but he also knew it would take time before she'd open up. A few days later, while Mary was out with Clara, Brian called his assistant, Marcos. "I want you to find out everything you can about Mary," he instructed, handing over a photograph. "Anything specific, Mr. Montero?" Marcos asked. "Family, past, anything she might be keeping from me." Brian avoided looking directly at his assistant, a flicker of guilt crossing his face. "Understood. I'll report back soon," Marcus replied. The next morning, Brian received a detailed dossier from Marcos. He read it slowly, absorbing each word. Mary had grown up in a struggling neighborhood and had taken care of her two younger brothers from an early age. After their parents died in a car accident when Mary was 17, she became their sole provider. She worked tirelessly at 2 jobs to support them, but eventually lost custody because she couldn't provide a stable home. Brian felt a pang of regret. as he imagined her shouldering that burden alone. Among the documents, an old photo stood out. Mary, much younger, holding her brothers. She looked hopeful, determined, even proud. That night, Brian found Mary in the garden, seated on the same bench where he had first seen her. Approaching cautiously, he sat down beside her. "I need to ask you something," he said quietly. Mary looked at him warily. "What is it now? Why have you never mentioned your family?" Mary tensed, caught off guard. "I don't see how that's any of your business." "Maybe it's not," Brian admitted, his tone softer than before. "But I read about what happened." Mary's eyes widened. "You read? What did you do?" Brian sighed, his voice calm but honest. "I needed to understand who you really are, Mary, and now I do." She stood abruptly, crossing her arms. "Do you think you can just pry into my life like this? My story isn't a game for you to dissect." "I'm not playing," Brian replied, standing as well. "I just wanted to know why you've built such high walls around yourself. And now I understand you've fought alone for so long that you don't believe anyone will stand by you." Mary shook her head, tears glistening in her eyes. "You don't know anything about me." "I know you lost everything," Brian said firmly, his voice carrying both conviction and sympathy. "And yet you never gave up. That's more than most people can say." Mary stared at the ground, her silence heavy. "I know I can't change the past," Brian continued, "but at least while you're here, I want you to know you're not alone." When Mary finally looked at him, she saw something genuine in his expression, something that made her pause. "Thank you," she said softly, before heading back inside. Brian remained on the bench, gazing at the stars. For the first time in years, he felt like he was beginning to see people not as chess pieces in his life, but as individuals with stories worth understanding. He hesitated before starting. "But I need to talk." Mary raised an eyebrow. Brian wasn't one to hesitate, and seeing him like this piqued her curiosity. "About what?" she asked. "About us and this situation," he said, gesturing vaguely. She stepped aside, allowing him in. Brian entered, pacing as if sorting his thoughts, before finally turning to her and crossing his arms. "I know I pushed you into this arrangement," he began, his voice softer than usual. "And I know I haven't exactly been fair." Mary tilted her head, caught off guard by his humble tone. "Is this an apology?" Brian offered a faint, crooked smile. "Maybe it is. I'm not exactly skilled at this." She crossed her arms and watched him closely. "Why are you saying this now?" "Because I've realized you deserve more than what I've given so far," he admitted, meeting her gaze. Mary stayed silent for a moment, letting his words sink in. For the first time, Brian seemed truly vulnerable. "I never asked for anything," she said gently. "All I did was agree to your terms." "I know," he replied quickly. "But I also know you deserve respect, and I haven't shown you that." The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard. She felt her resentment waver, though she wasn't ready to forgive him fully. "Respect is a good place to start," she finally said. Brian nodded, visibly relieved. "Can I stay here a while?" "If you promise not to criticize my simple furniture, I suppose you can," she replied, with a hint of humor. It drew a genuine smile from him. As the evening wore on, the two of them ended up on the floor, sharing a bottle of wine Mary had tucked away. Their conversation flowed effortlessly, surprising them both. Brian shared memories of his childhood, something he rarely did. He talked about the pressures of growing up in a wealthy household where emotions were considered weaknesses, and success was the only thing that mattered. "My mother always said love was a distraction," he said, swirling his wine. "She thought relationships were like business deals. You only get into them expecting a return." Mary let out a quiet laugh. "That explains a lot." "Don't judge me too quickly," Brian replied with a weary smile. "I know I'm a product of that world, but sometimes I wonder how different life could have been." Mary watched him, seeing a glimpse of the man behind the carefully crafted exterior. "You can still change, Brian." "You think so?" he asked, genuinely curious. "I think anyone can change if they really want to," she said with certainty. Brian's expression softened. "What about you? What would you change?" Mary paused, her eyes lowering. "I wish I'd been stronger in the past. Maybe my brothers would still be with me if I'd fought harder." "Mary, you did everything you could," Brian said firmly. "You can't blame yourself for that." "Easy for you to say," she muttered, staring at the floor. Brian leaned closer, holding her gaze. "You're the strongest person I've ever met. If no one's told you that before, I'm telling you now." Mary felt tears threaten to fall, but held them back. Instead, she gave a faint smile. "Thank you, Brian." In the days that followed, the atmosphere between them shifted subtly. Though they still exchanged teasing remarks, there was now a mutual understanding, a layer of respect that hadn't been there before. One afternoon, as Mary tended to flowers in the garden, Brian approached her with a relaxed demeanor. "I need your help," he said. Mary looked up, surprised. "Help? With what?" "I have an important meeting tonight," he said, "and I'd like you to come with me." She raised an eyebrow. "You want me to go to a business meeting with you?" Brian nodded. "You're my wife, remember?" Mary chuckled. "I thought that was just to fool your friends." "Maybe," he replied with a slight smile, "but I think your perspective could be valuable." She paused, mulling it over. Finally, she nodded. "All right, but don't expect me to sit quietly like a decorative accessory." "I wouldn't expect anything less," Brian said, a glint of amusement in his eyes. That evening, as they entered the meeting together, Mary felt the weight of the room's stairs, but she didn't shrink back. Bolstered by Brian's calm presence beside her, she held her head high. When one of the investors challenged the ethical approach of a new project, Mary surprised everyone by speaking up. "With all due respect," she began, "I don't believe profit and ethics need to be mutually exclusive. It's possible to achieve financial success without sacrificing what really matters." The room fell silent, all eyes on her. Brian stood beside her, unable to conceal his proud smile. The meeting's host, an older gentleman, dressed impeccably, nodded slowly. "An interesting perspective," he said. "Mrs. Montero, I'd like to hear more." Brian glanced at Mary with genuine admiration, once again struck by how different she was from anyone he had ever encountered. Back at the mansion, Mary was both drained and satisfied. She slipped off her shoes and sank into the living room sofa. Brian walked in a few moments later, hands in his pockets. He observed her for a moment before speaking. "You were amazing tonight," he said. "Thank you," she replied, with a weary smile. "I'm not just saying that to flatter you," he added. "You really have something special, Mary." She looked at him, surprised by his frankness. "Brian, what's gotten into you?" he laughed as he sat down beside her. "Maybe you're changing me." Mary gave a faint smile, but said nothing. Deep down, she could feel something shifting between them, though she wasn't sure what it meant. The week passed quickly, and Brian decided it was time to introduce Mary to an elite social event. The renowned annual ball attended by the most influential figures in the country. Mary, however, was far from thrilled. When Brian first mentioned it, she nearly dropped her coffee cup. "A ball? What kind of ball?" she asked, eyebrows raised. "It's an important event," Brian explained calmly, "and as my wife, you'll be the center of attention." Mary folded her arms and exhaled sharply. "Brian, I can barely manage formal dinners. You expect me to be comfortable around people who will scrutinize every move I make?" He shrugged. "You've already shown you can handle tough situations. It won't be as bad as you think." Mary narrowed her eyes. "Easy for you to say. You were born into this. I'm going to be a target, and you know it." Brian rubbed his temples, sighing. "Yes, they'll judge you, but you don't have to care. You're not there to please them." "Then why am I even going?" she pressed. "Because it matters to me," Brian replied sincerely. Mary fell silent for a moment, realizing that, for the first time, Brian wasn't demanding. He was asking. "Fine," she said at last, "but if anyone insults me, I'll respond." Brian smirked faintly. "That's exactly what I'd expect." When the day of the ball arrived, Clara and her team came early to prepare Mary. The mansion turned into a makeshift atelier, with fabrics, jewelry, and makeup tools spread across every surface. Mary stood uneasily as they adjusted her gown, a long, elegant silver dress that shimmered faintly. As she caught her reflection in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. "You look stunning," Clara said, as she smoothed the dress's hem. Mary forced a small smile. "I don't know. It doesn't feel like me." Clara took Mary's hands and spoke gently. "You may be wearing something different, but you're still you. Don't forget that." Mary nodded and took a deep breath. She would need all her courage for what lay ahead. When she descended the staircase, Brian was waiting in the grand foyer. He wore a flawless tuxedo, and as he saw her, he paused, his eyes scanning her from head to toe. "You look breathtaking," he said, his tone sincere. Mary blushed and looked away. "Thank you," she murmured. "You don't look so bad yourself." Brian offered his arm, and she took it, stepping into unfamiliar territory. The ballroom was a spectacle. Crystal chandeliers cast shimmering light over tables adorned with exotic flowers and gold accents. A live orchestra played softly, adding to the elegant atmosphere. As Mary and Brian entered, all eyes turned to them. Whispers rippled through the crowd, and Mary felt the weight of every glance. Her stomach tightened, but she raised her chin, recalling Brian's advice. "They're all staring at me," she whispered. "Let them stare," he said evenly. "They've got nothing better to do." Mary managed a small smile, comforted by his calm presence. The evening began with formal introductions. Brian guided her through the crowd, presenting her as his wife. Some greeted her with polite disinterest, while others were blatantly condescending. One woman stood out, Vanessa Belmont. Tall, blonde, and strikingly beautiful, Vanessa exuded an air of superiority. She approached Brian with a charming smile, completely ignoring Mary. "Brian, darling," Vanessa purred. "It's so good to see you." She rested a hand lightly on his arm. "And who is this distinguished young lady?" Mary narrowed her eyes, but before she could respond, Brian stepped in. "Vanessa, this is my wife, Mary. Vanessa raised her eyebrows, momentarily surprised, but quickly recovered, extending a polite hand. Ah, of course. A pleasure to meet you, Mary. Mary smiled politely, her expression calm, but her gaze sharp. The pleasure is mine. Vanessa tilted her head, scrutinizing Mary like a predator sizing up its prey. It must take a lot of courage to step into this world. Not everyone can handle it. Mary returned a sweet smile that didn't reach her eyes. Thank you for the advice. I imagine it must be especially hard for those who try too hard. Brian stifled a laugh as Vanessa's confidence faltered slightly, clearly unsettled by Mary's sharp reply. When the music shifted to a waltz, Brian extended his hand toward Mary. Shall we dance? He asked. Mary hesitated, looking around at the crowded room. I'm not very good at this. Neither am I, Brian said, his smile warm. Let's just pretend we are. She placed her hand in his, and they moved to the center of the ballroom. As they danced, Mary felt an unexpected ease in Brian's presence. You're doing well, he said, guiding her smoothly. Maybe that's because you're not stepping on my feet, she teased. Brian chuckled, and for a moment it felt as though the judgmental stares around them disappeared. Later that evening, as Mary rested at a table, Thomas approached with a sarcastic grin. So, Mary, he said, his tone dripping with mockery, how are you enjoying your role as the perfect wife? Mary crossed her arms, meeting his gaze. Quite well, thank you. Thomas laughed, but there was a sharp edge to it. I'll admit, you're doing better than I expected. But tell me, how long do you think it will last? Anger flared in Mary, but she kept her cool. What exactly are you trying to prove, Thomas? Me? Nothing. He feigned innocence. I just find it fascinating how Brian managed to find someone so unconventional. Before Mary could respond, Brian appeared, placing a firm hand on Thomas's shoulder. That's enough, Thomas. Thomas shrugged, raising his hands as if surrendering. Relax, Brian. Just having a little fun. Brian held his ground until Thomas retreated, then turned to Mary. Sorry about that, he said. No need to apologize, Mary replied. I can handle people like him. Brian studied her for a moment, impressed by her resilience. I know you can. When they finally left the ball, Mary felt a wave of relief. As the city lights streamed past the car windows, she turned to Brian. Why did you really bring me here? She asked. Because I wanted them to see who you are, Brian said, his tone honest. Mary gave a faint smile, but stayed quiet. For the first time, she sensed that Brian saw her as more than just a pawn in his game. In the days following the ball, the atmosphere in the Montero mansion began to shift. Mary and Brian started to see each other differently, though this growing connection also brought new tensions. As Mary lowered her guard, Brian seemed increasingly burdened by something he refused to discuss. Mary noticed it in his small gestures, the late nights in his office, the distracted look during meals, and the abrupt endings to their conversations when they ventured into personal territory. One morning, Mary walked into the library looking for a book and found Brian at his desk, holding a picture frame. He didn't notice her until she cleared her throat. Everything okay? She asked, noticing the sadness in his expression. Brian quickly put the frame down, trying to mask his feelings. Just memories from the past, he said. Curious, Mary approached and caught a glimpse of the photo. It showed a younger couple, presumably his parents, and a boy she assumed was Brian as a child. The bright smiles in the photo starkly contrasted with his current mood. "They look happy," Mary said softly. Brian ran a hand through his hair and sighed. "They seemed happy. But things aren't always as simple as a photograph makes them appear." Mary sat across from him. "Do you want to talk about it?" Brian hesitated. He wasn't used to opening up, but something about Mary encouraged trust. "My father was a difficult man," he began quietly. "He believed success came through absolute control, controlling business, people, even his own family. And my mother, she just went along with it, never questioned him." The bitterness in his tone was impossible to miss. "And you were caught in the middle of it all," Mary said gently. Brian nodded. "He expected me to follow in his footsteps, to be exactly like him. For a long time, I believed he was right. I thought the only way to survive was to be just as cold and calculating." "What about your mother? What did she think?" Mary pressed. Brian looked away, his answer weighed down by years of frustration. "She always said family came first, but in reality, she chose my father's demands over everything else. She never stood up for us." Mary stayed quiet, absorbing his words. It was the first time she felt she was seeing the real Brian, the man behind the cold, confident facade. "Maybe that's why you're so closed off," she said carefully. Brian let out a dry laugh. "Closed off is putting it nicely. I learned not to trust anyone. It's just easier that way." Mary leaned forward, meeting his eyes. "But you don't have to live like that. You can change, Brian." He stared at her, as if trying to believe her. Before he could respond, the mansion's doorbell rang, echoing insistently through the halls. Brian and Mary walked toward the entrance, where Marcos, Brian's assistant, was already watching the security monitor. "It's Thomas," Marcos said, his tone uneasy. Brian's brows furrowed. "What does he want now?" When the door opened, Thomas stepped in with his usual arrogant demeanor, but there was a distinct edge to him this time, something more aggressive, almost angry. "Brian, we need to talk," Thomas said, ignoring Mary completely. "I'm listening," Brian replied, folding his arms. Thomas glanced at Mary, then rolled his eyes. "In private, anything you have to say, you can say in front of her," Brian stated firmly. Thomas let out a mocking laugh. "Oh, so now she's your confidant. Interesting, considering what's at stake." Mary frowned, unease growing inside her. "What's going on?" Brian gave Thomas a sharp look. "Say what you came here to say." Thomas pulled a folder from his jacket and slammed it onto the table. "Here's everything. Proof that your bet went too far." Mary froze. "Bet? What bet?" Brian closed his eyes, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had known this day would come, but not so abruptly, not like this. Thomas, voice dripping with cruelty, began to explain. "Brian made a bet with us. He claimed he could marry someone like you, a woman completely outside his world, and keep you by his side for 3 months. It was all a game. You were just a pawn to him." Silence fell like a hammer. Mary turned to Brian, waiting for him to deny it, to call Thomas a liar. But Brian said nothing. "Brian?" Mary's voice cracked as she asked the question. "Mary, Brian began, but the words died in his throat. Mary stepped back, her world crumbling. "So, all of this was a lie? Every word? Every gesture? It's not that simple," he pleaded, desperation in his voice. Mary let out a bitter laugh, hollow and joyless. Not simple. You played with my life, Brian. You used me for a stupid bet. Mary, please, listen to me. He tried to step closer, but she raised her hand to stop him. No, she shouted. I don't want to hear anything else. You're exactly the man I thought you were when I first met you. Cold, selfish, and incapable of caring about anyone but yourself. Thomas smirked, clearly satisfied with the chaos he had caused. Well, I think my work here is done. Enjoy your evening. He left, leaving Mary and Brian alone in the tense, stifling silence. Mary took a deep breath, struggling to remain composed. I can't stay here, Brian. Not after this. Mary, please, Brian begged. I know I was wrong, but it wasn't just that. I truly care about you. Tears streamed down her face as she stared at him. If you cared, you wouldn't have done this. Without waiting for a reply, Mary went upstairs to pack her things. Brian remained in the room, feeling utterly defeated. For the first time in his life, he realized he had lost something money could never buy. Mary left the mansion that same night, refusing Brian's offer of a ride. She didn't know exactly where she was going, but she knew she needed to leave. The pain of his betrayal was too heavy to bear. As the rideshare car took her away, she stared at the passing city lights, searching for a path to rediscover herself. Brian stayed behind in his study, drowning in regret. He knew he had made the gravest mistake of his life. Now, all he could do was live with the consequences. Over the following weeks, Mary stayed at a modest boarding house on the city's outskirts. She used a portion of the money Brian had given her to rent a small room, and began looking for work. The void left by his betrayal was still there, but Mary knew she had to keep moving forward. Brian, meanwhile, was left to deal with the silence that filled the mansion. During the months Mary had been there, the place had felt alive. Now it seemed cold and empty. He spent long nights in his office, staring at the folder that had set everything in motion. One afternoon, Marcos walked into the office, holding a piece of paper. Mr. Montero, he said cautiously, I've managed to locate Mrs. Mary. Brian looked up in surprise. He had asked Marcos to find her, but he wasn't sure if she would ever let him approach her again. Is she all right? He asked, his voice softer than he expected. She's working as a waitress at a cafe downtown, Marcos replied. Brian paused, processing the information. Get the car ready, he finally said. Mary was wiping down a table in the small cafe where she'd started working when the bell above the door jingled. She paid no attention at first, used to the comings and goings of customers, until a familiar voice stopped her in her tracks. Mary. She turned to see Brian standing in the doorway, impeccably dressed, but with a hesitation in his eyes she had never seen before. Brian, she said, surprised and cautious. What are you doing here? He stepped forward, but kept his distance. I need to talk to you. There's nothing left to talk about, she replied, returning to her task at the table. Please, just give me 5 minutes, he said, his tone almost pleading. Mary stopped what she was doing and looked at him. Something in his demeanor had changed. He seemed more humble. Against her better judgment, she nodded. 5 minutes, she said, gesturing toward an empty table. Brian sat while Mary stood nearby, her arms crossed. I know I'm the last person you want to see, he began quietly, and I know what I did was unforgivable. Then why are you here? She asked, her voice firm. Because I realized you deserve so much more than I gave you. he said. "And I want to make things right, if you'll let me." Mary laughed bitterly. "Make things right, Brian? You turned my life into a game. You used me to stroke your ego. How exactly do you plan to fix that?" Brian exhaled heavily, running a hand through his hair. "I donated the money from the bet. Every last penny. I didn't want it tied to what happened between us." Mary's expression shifted to surprise. "You did that?" "Yes," Brian said. "But I know it doesn't erase what I did. I just want you to know that I regret it deeply." She stood silent for a moment, weighing his words. "What do you want from me now, Brian?" she finally asked. "I want a chance to prove I can be different," he said sincerely. "Not as part of a game, but because I care about you." Mary felt her heart tighten. She wanted to believe him, but the fear of being hurt remained. "I need time," she said, her voice trembling. Brian nodded, showing respect for her decision. "I'll wait as long as it takes." In the weeks that followed, both their lives began to change. Brian immersed himself in social projects Mary had once mentioned. He visited struggling communities, listening to stories of hardship similar to Mary's own experiences. Meanwhile, Mary continued working at the cafe, trying to rebuild her life, but she couldn't shake the memory of Brian's words. They lingered, making her wonder if he truly had changed. One day, at the market, Mary ran into Clara, the stylist who had worked with her at the mansion. "Mary, what a surprise," Clara said, warmly embracing her. Mary smiled. "Clara, what brings you here?" "I'm visiting a social project nearby," Clara replied. "Brian has been organizing some amazing initiatives. He's really dedicated." Mary froze for a moment. She had always known Brian could use his wealth to support causes, but never imagined him personally involved. "Was he here today?" she asked, trying to sound nonchalant. "Yes," Clara said. "You should see him, Mary. He's not the same man he used to be." Clara's words echoed in Mary's mind as she walked home. Maybe it was time to see for herself. The next morning, Mary found herself at the mansion's gate, her heart pounding. Inside the garden, Brian stood among a group of children involved in an educational project. He looked different, more at ease, more genuine. When he noticed her, he froze briefly, then walked over with a hesitant smile. "Mary," he said, "I wasn't expecting you." "I wanted to see for myself," she said, glancing around. "Clara mentioned the projects you've been working on." Brian nodded, shoving his hands into his pockets. "You inspired me, Mary. Before I met you, I never thought about using my resources for anything truly meaningful." She studied him closely, searching his face. "You really have changed, haven't you?" she said softly. "I'm trying," he replied. "And I'll do whatever it takes to prove that to you." Mary took a deep breath, feeling a weight lift. "Brian, I don't know if I can forget what happened, but maybe I can forgive you." His eyes lit up with hope. That's all I could ask for. Their time in the garden rekindled a connection between them, but both knew the road ahead would be uncertain. Later, when Mary accepted Brian's invitation to have lunch at the mansion, it was a small but significant step toward finding balance. The atmosphere during lunch felt different. Mary, less guarded than before, seemed more relaxed, while Brian showed a vulnerable, attentive side that was new to her. "I saw the children in the garden," Mary said, breaking the silence. "You're really involved in those projects, aren't you?" Brian nodded, placing his napkin beside his plate. Yes, for the first time, using my money for something meaningful makes me feel human, and I owe that to you. Mary tilted her head, intrigued. To me? Yes, Brian replied with a faint smile. You made me see how detached I was from reality. Your stories, your strength, they made me question who I was and what I was doing with my life. Mary felt her chest tighten. Brian's words sounded genuine, but her fear of trusting him again held her back. Brian, she said cautiously, it's not enough to say you've changed. Actions matter more than words. I know, he said without hesitation. That's why I'll do whatever it takes to prove to you that I'm not the man I used to be. In the days that followed, Mary began joining Brian on his social projects. He invited her to visit a community school, being renovated with funds he had provided. Although hesitant at first, Mary eventually agreed, curious to see how he would handle the unfamiliar environment. When they reached the school, children and volunteers greeted Brian warmly. He seemed genuinely interested in hearing their stories and understanding the challenges they faced. Mary was surprised to see how naturally he interacted with everyone. You're doing well, Mary said as she watched Brian discuss the school's needs with the teacher. He turned to her with a calm smile. I never imagined this would mean so much to me. I didn't know helping others could be so rewarding. Mary returned his smile, feeling a connection growing between them. For the first time, she started to believe Brian's transformation was real. Despite the progress, Mary still needed time to process her emotions. I need to get back to the cafe, she said one morning, as they had breakfast in the mansion. Brian frowned, clearly disappointed, but he nodded. If that's what you need, I understand. Thank you, Mary said softly. But that doesn't mean I don't see what you're doing. I just need a little more time. I'll wait, Mary, Brian said. As long as it takes. While Mary returned to her cafe routine, Brian continued devoting himself to his projects. He spent hours meeting with nonprofits, community leaders, and volunteers, trying to make up for all the years he had ignored the world outside his wealth. During one of these meetings, Clara approached him. You've changed, Brian, Clara said, smiling. Mary would be proud of what you're doing. Brian offered a modest smile. I just hope she sees it one day. Clara placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. She does, but trust her timing. Mary isn't someone who's easily swayed by words. You're showing her you can be more. Brian nodded, feeling more determined. One afternoon, as Mary served customers at the cafe, a group of children burst through the door, followed by Brian. Dressed casually, something rare for him, he carried a bag full of books. Mary approached him, surprised. Brian, what are you doing here? I promised to bring the kids some books, he said, motioning toward the children who were already flipping through the pages. They insisted on coming along. Mary laughed, shaking her head. You really have changed, haven't you? I'm trying, he replied earnestly. I hope you see that. Mary looked at him for a long moment, her emotions mixed. She could feel herself starting to trust him again, even though she still harbored some doubts. Later that evening, after closing the cafe, Mary found an envelope on the counter. Inside was a handwritten letter from Brian. Mary, I know words can't undo what I've done, but I hope they can at least show you how much you've changed my life. Before I met you, I lived in a hollow world filled with things that never really mattered. You showed me that there's more to life than money and power, and I'll always be grateful. I know that regaining your trust will take time, but I'm willing to wait, not because it's a challenge, but because you're the only person who's ever made me want to be a better man. With affection, Brian. Mary felt tears stream down her face as she read the letter. She knew the road ahead would still be difficult, but for the first time, she thought maybe, just maybe, he deserved a second chance. The morning sun shone brightly as Mary set up the cafe tables, thinking about how much her life had changed since leaving the Montero mansion. 3 months had passed, and though she had rebuilt parts of her routine, something still felt unfinished. When the doorbell chimed, she looked up and saw Brian standing there. Dressed simply, he wore an expression she'd never seen before, a mix of nervousness and hope. "Brian," she said, startled. "What are you doing here?" He stepped forward, hesitating before he spoke. "I needed to see you, Mary. I have to tell you something I can't keep inside anymore." Mary crossed her arms, struggling to keep her emotional guard up. "I think we've said all there is to say, don't you?" "Maybe," he replied, his gaze steady. "But I couldn't let you walk away without trying again, without telling you how much you've changed me." Mary exhaled deeply, setting the cloth she'd been holding on the counter. "And what exactly do you want from me now, Brian? Another chance to prove you can always win?" "No," he answered quickly. "I never want to hurt you again, Mary. The man you met during that foolish contract is gone. You've shown me that life is about more than power and money. I'm here because I want to be the kind of man who's worthy of you." Her heart pounded, though she kept her face composed. His words sounded genuine, but the betrayal still stung. "Have you really changed, Brian?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm trying, Mary," he said earnestly, "and I just need a chance to prove it, not with words, but with actions." She studied his face, searching for sincerity. Finally, she said, "Change takes time, Brian. So does forgiveness." He nodded, a faint smile playing on his lips. "I know, and I'm willing to wait as long as it takes." In the weeks that followed, Mary and Brian began spending more time together. He invited her to see the social projects he'd initiated, and she, in turn, showed him her world at the cafe. Slowly, Mary started noticing a difference in him. The man standing beside her wasn't the same person she'd known months earlier. One day, Brian took Mary to a charity event in an underserved neighborhood. She agreed, curious to see how he behaved in such an environment. During the event, Brian spoke to the gathered crowd, detailing the community changes his efforts had helped bring. As he spoke, he met Mary's eyes and smiled, a moment of unspoken understanding passing between them. After his speech, Brian approached her and extended a hand. "Come with me. I want to show you something." He led her back to the mansion and into the garden, a place that had witnessed so many of their pivotal conversations. But this time, it looked entirely different. The space was transformed, with lights strung from the trees and a path of petals leading to an arch covered in white and red roses. Beneath the arch stood a small table, set with wine and 2 glasses. Mary was stunned, taking in the scene. "Brian, what is this?" "Something I needed to do," he said, guiding her down the flower-strewn path. When they reached the arch, he took her hands in his. "Mary, you've changed my life in ways I never could have imagined. Before you, I was empty, consumed by control and success. But you've shown me what truly matters: people, connection, love." Tears filled her eyes as she let him continue. "I know our beginning was wrong, and I can't change the past. But I promise to give you a better future if you'll let me." Brian released her hands and pulled a small velvet box from his pocket. He dropped to one knee, looking up at her with a vulnerability she'd never seen before. "Mary," he began, his voice trembling, "I don't want you to be my wife because of a contract or a bet. I want you to be my wife because I love you. I want to build a life with you, founded on respect, trust, and true love. Will you marry me for real this time?" Mary covered her mouth, tears streaming down her cheeks. She hesitated for a moment, torn between past pain and present hope. But as she looked into Brian's eyes, she saw regret, sincerity, and love. "Yes, Brian," she said, her voice shaking. "I'll marry you." Brian's face broke into a radiant smile. He slipped the ring onto her finger, then rose to pull her into a tight embrace. They stood there beneath the lights, as if the rest of the world had faded away. 2 months later, the ceremony took place in the same garden. The setting was even more breathtaking than before, adorned with fresh flowers and glowing candles. Mary wore a delicate white gown, her hair styled in an elegant bun, adorned with small flowers. Brian, in a classic black suit, stood at the altar, his eyes bright with emotion as Mary walked toward him. Each step she took carried the promise of a new beginning. The guests, a mix of friends, volunteers, and people who had become integral to their lives, sat quietly, moved by the authenticity of the union. When it came time to exchange vows, Brian held Mary's hands tightly. "Mary, you are the best thing that's ever happened to me. I promise to love you, respect you, and stand by your side through every moment, good or bad. Thank you for giving me the chance to become a better man." Tears welled in Mary's eyes as she replied, "Brian, you've shown me that people can change and that true love requires courage." "Sure, here's a rewritten and paraphrased version. I promise to always stand by your side as we create our life together." When the officiant declared them husband and wife, their kiss was met with cheers from the crowd. Flower petals floated through the air as applause filled the garden. The reception was a celebration of music, laughter, and joyful dancing. Brian and Mary, holding hands, savored every moment, grateful for overcoming the struggles of their past and excited to build their future. Thank you so much for watching. What do you think about this story? Was it a true testament to love and change? Was Mary right to forgive Brian and marry him? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to give this video a thumbs up if it touched your heart. Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to rate this story from 0 to 10. If you want more inspiring stories, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a new upload. See you in the next video.